The morning of April 18, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto emerged from his quarters at exactly 5:45, dressed not in the crisp white ceremonial uniform expected for such occasions, but in the dull khaki green of an army officer. His staff noticed. They said nothing. He carried a sword in his left hand. 2 fingers were missing from that hand, torn away by Russian shellfire at Tsushima Strait 38 years earlier, when he was a young ensign and Japan's navy had crushed the Tsar's fleet. That victory had made Japan a world power. Now, in 1943, the world he had helped build was collapsing around him. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura stood waiting near the aircraft. The general had something urgent to say. Imamura had survived the sinking of the Houston just over a year earlier. Japanese torpedoes ironically aimed at the American cruiser but striking his own transport instead. Then, 2 months ago, he had nearly been shot down flying this exact route over Bougainville. American fighters appearing from nowhere. He told Yamamoto the flight was dangerous. The Americans were active in these skies. Their P-38 Lightning fighters had been spotted ranging far from Guadalcanal, farther than anyone thought possible. The schedule for this inspection tour had been transmitted by radio. Encoded, yes, but the Americans were listening. They were always listening. Yamamoto's response was polite but final. The tour had been announced. Japanese forces across the Solomon Islands were expecting their commander. Morale demanded his presence. To cancel now would suggest fear, would suggest the Americans control Japanese movements. That could not be permitted. Vice Admiral Matomagaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, reinforced the decision. The boost to morale from this inspection tour was critical. Operation Igo had just concluded. Japanese pilots were reporting spectacular victories. Dozens of American ships sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed. The numbers were exaggerated, wildly so, but Yamamoto had accepted them without challenge. He needed something to celebrate. The war was going badly and everyone knew it. If we stop remembering their sacrifice, it's as if they died twice. Please subscribe to this channel so their stories are never forgotten. Rear Admiral Takoji Joshima had also tried to intervene. When he learned the detailed itinerary was being transmitted by radio, he was horrified. He flew to Rabaul specifically to beg Yamamoto to reconsider. The schedule included precise times, specific locations, aircraft types, escort numbers. Everything an enemy would need for an ambush. The message had even been sent twice, once through naval channels and again through army communications, doubling the chance of interception. Yamamoto listened. He acknowledged the concerns. He proceeded anyway. The admiral who had studied at Harvard, who had lived in America and understood its industrial might better than any Japanese officer, who had warned his government that war with the United States was madness, was now committed to a path he could not alter. He had told them Japan might prevail for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, he had no expectation of success. Midway had proven him correct. That had been 11 months ago. Everything since had been retreat disguised as strategic adjustment. But this morning, none of that mattered. What mattered was maintaining the fiction that Japan was winning, that the setbacks were temporary, that one more offensive would turn the tide. So Yamamoto would fly to Bougainville and congratulate pilots on victories that existed mainly in their imaginations. At 6 o'clock precisely, as scheduled in the intercepted message, 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers lifted off from Rabaul. 6 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters rose with them as escorts. Yamamoto sat in the lead bomber's passenger compartment, left front seat, next to Chief Petty Officer Kotani. Behind him sat members of his staff. Vice Admiral Igaki flew in the second bomber with his own contingent. The formation turned south, climbing to around 6,000 feet. The flight time to Balali Airfield near Bougainville would be approximately 1 hour and 35 minutes. The schedule called for arrival at 8 o'clock. Yamamoto was famous for punctuality. The Americans were counting on it. 435 miles to the southeast, on Guadalcanal, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters had taken off at 7:10 that morning. Actually, only 16 made it airborne. One blew a tire on the runway. Another's auxiliary fuel tanks failed to feed properly. The remaining 16 formed up and turned northwest, staying low over the water. Major John Mitchell led the mission. He commanded the 339th Fighter Squadron, equipped with the only aircraft in the theater capable of making this flight. The P-38 was a strange machine, unlike any other fighter in service. Twin fuselages, twin engines, twin tails. The pilot sat in a central nacelle between the booms. All the guns were mounted in the nose. One 20mm cannon, for 50 caliber machine guns, all pointing straight ahead with devastating concentration of fire. The Lightning was fast, over 400 miles per hour at altitude. It was powerful, with two Allison V1710 engines producing nearly 1,500 horsepower each. But for this mission, speed and power mattered less than range. The round trip would cover nearly 1,000 miles. Normal fuel capacity was insufficient. Each aircraft carried two massive drop tanks beneath its wings, 100-gallon external tanks that looked absurdly large hanging under the sleek fuselages. The flight plan was precise to the minute. Mitchell had calculated every leg personally. 600 miles outbound on a circuitous route, swinging wide to the west to avoid Japanese observation posts in the Solomon Islands. Then a turn northeast to intercept Yamamoto's formation near the coast of Bougainville. The timing had to be exact. Too early and they would miss the bombers. Too late and Yamamoto would already be on the ground under the protection of 75 Zeros based at Kahili Airfield. Mitchell figured the odds of even finding Yamamoto at maybe 1,000 to 1. Intercepting two bombers over the trackless Pacific, navigating by compass and dead reckoning, with no margin for error and no second chances. And that was before considering the inevitable Japanese response. This was, by any reasonable measure, a suicide mission. The 16 P-38s flew at wavetop height, sometimes as low as 10 feet above the water. Radio silence was absolute. The noise of 32 engines at full power was deafening inside the cockpits, a constant roar that would continue for hours. Pilots counted sharks in the water below. Some counted pieces of driftwood. One pilot later said he didn't remember doing anything except sweating. The formation split into two elements. Mitchell led the top cover flight of 12 aircraft. Their job was to engage the Zero escorts and keep them away from the bombers. Captain Thomas Lanfear led the killer flight of 4 P-38s. His mission was simpler and harder. Find the bombers carrying Yamamoto. Shoot them down. Don't let them reach the airfield. Lanfear was an aggressive pilot, already decorated with a Silver Star and Distinguished Flying Cross. He flew a P-38 he called Phoebe. His wingman was Lieutenant Rex Barber, a quieter man from Oregon who had earned his own Silver Star. Barber's usual aircraft, Diablo, was out of commission. Today he flew Miss Virginia, a plane that had already destroyed two Japanese float planes and heavily damaged a submarine chaser. Neither pilot knew exactly what they were hunting. The briefing had mentioned a VIP, someone important enough to justify this extreme mission. They had been told the intelligence came from Australian coast watchers observing Rabaul. That was a lie designed to protect the real source. It didn't take long for the pilots to figure out the truth. When you break radio silence to send American fighters 400 miles to intercept one specific flight, the intelligence came from somewhere more reliable than binoculars. The Americans had been reading Japanese naval codes for nearly 2 years. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, had cracked the JN-25 cipher system before Midway. That breakthrough had allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his carriers perfectly for the battle that turned the Pacific War. The same codebreakers were still reading Japanese messages. They read everything. On April 14, 1943, multiple American listening posts had intercepted a Japanese naval message. The encryption was standard JN-25D cipher. The message bore the header C&C, Combined Fleet, an obvious reference to Yamamoto. The codebreakers went to work. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Alva Laswell was on duty when the decrypt came through. He read it and immediately understood what he was seeing. The message contained Yamamoto's complete itinerary for April 18th. Departure time from Rabaul, 6 o'clock, Tokyo time. Route, direct to Belaley Airfield. Arrival time, 8 o'clock, Tokyo time. Aircraft types, 2G-4M bombers. Escort, 6A-6M fighters. every detail an ambush would require. Laswell later said he exclaimed, "We've hit the jackpot." The translation went immediately to Commander Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer. Layton took it straight to Admiral Nimitz. The two men discussed implications. This was an opportunity that might never come again. Yamamoto rarely left headquarters. He never flew this close to American-controlled territory. This might be the only chance to kill the man who planned Pearl Harbor. But there were risks. If they ambushed Yamamoto, the Japanese would know the Americans had advance intelligence. They might conclude their codes were compromised. Every future advantage from codebreaking could be lost. British intelligence officers were furious when they learned of the plan. Winston Churchill formally protested to President Franklin Roosevelt. The British argued that no single admiral, not even Yamamoto, was worth sacrificing the ability to read enemy communications. The Americans disagreed. This was personal in a way the British couldn't understand. The British hadn't suffered Pearl Harbor. They hadn't watched their Pacific Fleet burn at anchor. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox sent a message to Nimitz. President attaches extreme importance to mission. Whether Roosevelt actually said, "Get Yamamoto," is uncertain. No official record exists, but the order was clear regardless of its exact wording. Nimitz asked Layton a critical question. Could the Japanese replace Yamamoto with someone better? Layton, who had known Yamamoto personally during his pre-war service as naval attaché in Tokyo, said no. No other Japanese admiral had Yamamoto's stature among the Japanese people. No one had his experience, his innovative thinking, his charisma. His death would be a severe blow to Japanese morale. The decision was made. Kill Yamamoto. Protect the code-breaking secret by any means necessary. Vice Admiral William Halsey received the order to plan and execute the operation. He passed it to Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded air forces in the Solomons. Mitcher called it Operation Vengeance. The name was not subtle. This was revenge for Pearl Harbor, and everyone involved knew it. The planning fell to Mitchell and the P-38 pilots. No other aircraft could make the flight. Navy and Marine Corps F-4F Wildcats and F-4U Corsairs lacked the range. The P-38s, with their auxiliary tanks, could barely manage it. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Luther Moore found and installed U.S. Navy ship compasses in Mitchell's aircraft and possibly others to aid navigation. Every detail mattered. There would be no second attempt. The pilots were told they were hunting a VIP. They were given the cover story about Australian coast watchers. They were briefed on the timing, the route, the expected opposition. Then they waited. April 17th passed slowly. Some pilots wrote letters. Some played cards. Some just sat and thought about what the next morning might bring. Now, the morning of April 18th, they were 90 minutes into the flight. The P-38s droned northwest across the empty ocean. Fuel gauges crept steadily downward. The massive drop tanks would provide extra range, but only if everything went perfectly. There was no margin for combat maneuvering, no fuel for prolonged dogfighting. Find the bombers, shoot them down, get out. That was the mission. At 9:30 local time, Mitchell's formation reached the calculated intercept point off the coast of Bougainville. They began a climb from wavetop height to 18,000 feet, gaining altitude for the attack. Mitchell scanned the sky. Nothing. For a moment, it appeared the 1,000-to-1 odds had held. They had flown 400 miles to an empty sky. Then someone spotted them. 2 bombers, 6 fighters, exactly as intelligence had predicted. The formation was approaching from the northwest at about 6,000 feet, slightly lower than expected. The timing was perfect. The Japanese were 14 minutes from landing at Kahili. Mitchell gave the order. The top cover flight continued climbing to engage the Zeros. The killer flight dropped their auxiliary tanks and dove for the bombers. The Japanese saw them coming. The Betty bombers immediately descended, heading for the jungle canopy at full power. The Zero escorts turned to meet the diving P-38s. For a few seconds, the careful plan held together. Then everything dissolved into chaos. Lieutenant Ray Hines' P-38 was hit almost immediately. A Zero pilot named Kenji Yanagia later claimed he heavily damaged a Lightning escorting another P-38 that hadn't dropped its tanks. Hein's aircraft disappeared. He was never found. Lanfear pulled up to engage Zeros attacking from above. That decision would create controversy that lasted decades. Lanfear claimed he then dove on one of the bombers and shot it down. Other pilots disputed this. The truth became lost in contradictory testimony and decades of bitter argument. What is certain is that Lieutenant Rex Barber closed on the first Betty from behind. His 450 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon concentrated their fire on the bomber's right engine. The engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the wing. The Betty rolled right and dove into the jungle near Bin. That bomber carried Admiral Yamamoto. The second Betty, carrying Vice Admiral Igaki, was also hit. This pilot lost control and the aircraft crashed into the ocean at full speed. Igaki survived, found himself floating in the water as everything went black around him. 3 others from his aircraft also survived. Everyone on Yamamoto's bomber died. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 2 minutes. The P-38s, critically low on fuel, broke contact and turned for home. One had to land in the Russell Islands, completely out of fuel. The rest made it back to Guadalcanal running on fumes. Mitchell was the last to land. One engine quit during his landing rollout. He had timed it perfectly. They had flown over 800 miles, intercepted the bombers within seconds of the predicted time, completed the mission, and returned with fuel tanks showing empty. Lanfear radioed as he approached Henderson Field. That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House. It was a security breach, breaking radio silence to crow about a mission whose very existence needed to remain secret. But in that moment, with adrenaline still surging and the target confirmed destroyed, operational security seemed less important than victory. In Bougainville, a Japanese search party found Yamamoto's bomber the next day. The aircraft had crashed in the jungle southwest of Bin. The fuselage was shattered, but remarkably intact for such a violent impact. Yamamoto's body was found still strapped in his seat, thrown clear of the wreckage but upright, his hand still gripping his sword. The search party described him as appearing in a state of great dignity. An autopsy revealed 2 50 caliber bullet wounds. One entered the back of his left shoulder. Another struck the left side of his lower jaw and exited above his right eye. The head wound had killed him probably before the aircraft hit the ground. At 60 years old, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had died as he had warned his government Japan would die, fighting a war that could not be won against an enemy whose industrial power Japan could never match. The Japanese government did not announce his death immediately. They needed time to manage the shock, to prepare the nation for the loss of their most celebrated naval commander. On May 21, 1943, more than a month after the ambush, Tokyo radio broadcast the news. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, while directing general strategy on the front line in April of this year, engaged in combat with the enemy and met gallant death in a warplane. FCC monitors listening to the broadcast reported that the announcer's voice seemed to break toward the end, choked with emotion. The statement gave no details about how Yamamoto died, where he died, or what he had been doing. Just that he was gone. In the United States, speculation ran wild. April had been a quiet month in the Pacific with no major combat that would explain an admiral's death in combat. Some suggested an airplane crash. Others wondered if harakiri might be the answer, suicide in response to Japan's declining fortunes. Nobody official confirmed anything. The truth remained classified. Admiral Nimitz and his intelligence staff understood that revealing Operation Vengeance would expose the code-breaking operation. They prepared elaborate cover stories. They planned additional P-38 raids on the Shortland Islands to make the Yamamoto mission look like a lucky strike during routine operations. They told the pilots to attribute their intelligence to Australian coast watchers if asked. This is not just history. These were real lives lost, real families destroyed. If this moved you, please subscribe and help keep their voices alive. But secrets the spectacular don't stay secret, especially when the people who know them are young fighter pilots fresh from a mission that would make them famous. Tom Lanfear and Rex Barber enjoyed 10 days of leave in New Zealand after the mission. They went golfing with Brigadier General Dean Strother. An Associated Press correspondent named J. Norman Lodge approached them at the golf course. Lodge seemed to know a lot about the mission already. He used an old reporter's trick, asking the pilots to just clarify some details. Amazingly, Lanfear and Barber talked. They confirmed details. They described the mission. Strother told Lodge to forget about a story because military censors would never allow it. The reporter wasn't deterred. Details began leaking. Pilots talked to other pilots. Officers gossiped at command briefings. By October 1943, 6 months after the mission, Time magazine ran an article about Operation Vengeance. The article mentioned Captain Lanfear by name. It described how P-38 pilots from Guadalcanal had shot down 3 Japanese bombers over Bougainville, then wondered if they had killed some Jap bigwig. The U.S. Navy was outraged. This was an egregious security breach that potentially compromised the entire code-breaking operation. Major John Mitchell had been nominated for the Medal of Honor for leading the mission. In response to the security leak, his award was downgraded to the Navy Cross. All the pilots who flew the mission received Navy Crosses instead of the higher recognition they might have earned if they had kept their mouths shut. The Japanese, remarkably, did not draw conclusions from the Time article. They had periodically changed their codes, issuing new codebooks just 2 weeks before Operation Vengeance. But logistical challenges had prevented the new books from reaching Rabaul and Bougainville in time. If the new codes had been in place, the Americans likely couldn't have decrypted Yamamoto's itinerary in time for the mission. The Japanese continued believing their codes were secure. They attributed the ambush to the very cover story the Americans had planted. Australian coast watchers were known to be operating in the Solomons. They had excellent observation posts and radio equipment. It was plausible they had observed Yamamoto's departure from Rabaul and radioed the information to American forces. The Japanese respected these coast watchers' capabilities, even held them in high regard. The cover story worked perfectly. Only after Japan's surrender in September 1945 did the Americans publicly disclose that Operation Vengeance had been based on decrypted communications. By then, it didn't matter. The war was over. The code-breaking secret was safe for history books instead of operational security. Yamamoto's body was cremated at Bin. His ashes were placed aboard the battleship Musashi, the largest warship ever constructed, the vessel that represented everything Yamamoto had envisioned for Japan's navy and everything that vision had cost. Musashi carried him home to Tokyo. On June 5, 1943, Japan gave Yamamoto a state funeral. The ceremony was elaborate, befitting a national hero. He received posthumously the title of Marshal Admiral, the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was awarded the Grand Cordon of the Order of the Chrysanthemum, First Class. Nazi Germany, Japan's ally, awarded him posthumously the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords. Some of his ashes were buried in Tokyo's Tama Cemetery. The remainder went to his ancestral burial grounds at Chukoji Temple in Nagaoka City, the place he had come from 60 years earlier as a poor schoolteacher's son named Isoroku Takano. Admiral Minaichi Koga succeeded Yamamoto as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Koga was capable, experienced, respected. He was not Yamamoto. No one was Yamamoto, the man who had unified Japan's carrier strategy, who had transformed the Imperial Navy into an instrument of offensive naval aviation, who had planned Pearl Harbor and shaped Japan's entire approach to the Pacific War, was gone. The knowledge went with him. For the Americans, Yamamoto's death was more than just revenge for Pearl Harbor, though revenge certainly mattered. It was psychological warfare on a strategic scale. Japanese naval personnel suffered a blow to morale that never fully recovered. They had believed Yamamoto was invincible, that his strategic genius would find a path to victory despite the odds. When he died, shot down by American fighters in broad daylight, that belief died with him. Allied forces felt the opposite effect. If the architect of Pearl Harbor could be hunted down and killed with such precision, nothing was beyond reach. The mission demonstrated American intelligence capabilities, even if the full extent of those capabilities remained classified. It showed American reach. P-38 fighters from Guadalcanal could now strike targets 400 miles away with minute-by-minute accuracy. That changed the calculus of every Japanese operation in the theater. The controversy over who actually shot down Yamamoto's bomber began almost immediately and never really ended. Lanfear claimed credit. He wrote the official mission report, the medal citations, multiple magazine articles. In all of them, he portrayed himself as the pilot who killed Yamamoto. Rex Barber disagreed. He had been Lanfear's wingman. He had closed on the first bomber from behind and watched his tracers tear into its right engine. He saw it catch fire and crash into the jungle. Barber believed he had shot down Yamamoto's aircraft, and several other pilots supported his claim. Japanese Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya, who had been in Yamamoto's escort, provided testimony after the war. He told Mitchell he saw Yamamoto's Betty crash 20 to 30 seconds after being hit from behind by fire from a P-38. The testimony seemed to support Barber's claim. But Lanfear had already written himself into history as Yamamoto's killer, and he never wavered from that claim. In 1987, Lanfear died. Most newspaper obituaries credited him with killing Yamamoto. The controversy didn't end. Barber continued contesting Lanfear's claim in military circles and publications until his own death in 2001. Other pilots who flew the mission grew tired of the argument. Lieutenant Julius Jacobson remarked in 1997, "There were 15 of us who survived, and as far as who did the effective shooting, who cares?" Admiral Nimitz's chief of staff said years later, "Historians, fighter pilots, and all of us who have studied the record of this extraordinary mission will forever speculate as to the exact events of that day in 1943. There is glory for the whole team." In 2024, after reviewing all available evidence, aviation historians reached a consensus. The credit should go to Rex Barber. The trajectory of the bullets, the testimony of witnesses, the timing of the crash, all pointed to Barber as the pilot who fired the fatal shots. Lanfear had engaged Zeros. That was valuable work that protected Barber during his attack run. But the bomber that crashed in the jungle with Yamamoto aboard was destroyed by Barber's guns. It doesn't change the essential truth. 16 P-38 pilots flew an impossible mission and succeeded. Yamamoto died because American codebreakers read his mail, American intelligence analyzed it correctly, American commanders made the hard decision to risk the code-breaking secret, and American pilots executed a plan that required perfect navigation, perfect timing, and perfect shooting. The question of which specific pilot fired which specific bullets matters less than what they accomplished together. But the mission had consequences beyond Yamamoto's death, beyond the boost to Allied morale, beyond the blow to Japanese confidence. It revealed something about the nature of the war that Japanese leadership either didn't understand or chose to ignore. Yamamoto had flown into an ambush because warnings were ignored. Lieutenant General Imamura warned him about the danger. Rear Admiral Joshima warned him about transmitting the schedule by radio. Staff officers warned him about American capabilities, about the P-38s ranging far beyond their expected radius, about the risk of flying predictable routes at predictable times. Yamamoto acknowledged the warnings and proceeded anyway, not because he was reckless, not because he didn't understand the danger, but because the system he served valued appearances over reality, morale over operational security, the fiction of Japanese invincibility over the truth of Japanese vulnerability. This pattern repeated throughout the Pacific War. Japanese commanders received intelligence about American capabilities and dismissed it as defeatist thinking. They were told their codes might be compromised and continued using them anyway. They were warned about specific threats and proceeded as if the warnings didn't exist. The same institutional arrogance that led to Pearl Harbor led to Midway. The same refusal to accept the uncomfortable reality that produced catastrophic defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal sent Yamamoto flying into an ambush that anyone with eyes could see coming. After Yamamoto's death, nothing changed. The pattern continued. Japanese forces fought with desperate courage and died in vast numbers defending positions that couldn't be held. They launched offensives that had no chance of success. They continued believing or pretending to believe that victory was possible when every objective measure showed it was not. The Americans, meanwhile, were reading everything. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, the codebreakers who had made Operation Vengeance possible, continued breaking Japanese codes throughout the war. Every fleet movement, every operation plan, every strategic decision was intercepted, decoded, analyzed, and used to devastating effect. The Japanese never fully accepted that their codes were compromised. They made adjustments. They changed codebooks. They modified procedures. But they never fundamentally grasped that the Americans were reading their most sensitive communications nearly in real time. This intelligence advantage shaped every major engagement after Midway. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American carriers were positioned perfectly to slaughter Japanese naval aviation in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, American forces knew Japanese fleet movements before Japanese field commanders did. The intelligence advantage from code breaking, protected by the cover story of Australian coast watchers and routine fighter sweeps, was worth divisions. And it all could have been lost if the Japanese had drawn the right conclusions from Yamamoto's death. A careful analysis would have shown that the Americans had specific, detailed intelligence about his itinerary. The precision of the intercept, the exact timing, the focus on those particular two bombers, all suggested advanced knowledge that could only come from compromised communications. But conducting that analysis would have required admitting Japanese communication security was flawed. It would have required acknowledging American capabilities exceeded Japanese estimates. It would have required accepting that Japan's enemies were winning not just through industrial might but through intellectual superiority in signals intelligence. The institutional culture that sent Yamamoto to his death couldn't make those admissions. So the war continued. Japanese forces fought magnificently with inadequate resources against an enemy who knew their plans before they executed them. The result was foreordained, visible to anyone willing to see it. Yamamoto had seen it before Pearl Harbor. He told the government he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that he had no expectation of success. He was right about the timeline. Midway came almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. He was right about the outcome, too. By April 1943, when he died, Japan had been in retreat for 10 months. Guadalcanal was lost. The Solomons were being rolled back. New Guinea was contested. The defensive perimeter Japan had seized in the war's opening months was collapsing section by section. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. American industry was producing ships and aircraft at rates Japan couldn't match. Yamamoto knew this. His staff knew this. Japanese naval intelligence knew this. They couldn't say it openly because saying it would be defeatist. So instead they congratulated pilots on phantom victories, celebrated tactical successes that didn't exist, and sent their commander-in-chief flying into an obvious trap because canceling the flight would admit the Americans controlled Japanese decision-making. The cost of this institutional delusion can be measured in lives. Yamamoto's death was just one man, but he represented hundreds of thousands of Japanese military personnel who died in the 2 years after his death, fighting battles that couldn't be won for strategic objectives that couldn't be achieved. The American pilots who flew Operation Vengeance paid a price too, though different in kind. Raymond Hine died during the mission. His P-38 was hit by a Zero and disappeared into the ocean. His body was never recovered. He was 24 years old. The survivors carried the mission with them for the rest of their lives. Some, like Lanfear, made it central to their identity, writing and speaking about it until they died. Others, like Barber, fought the controversy when pressed but mostly wanted to move past it. Mitchell, who led the mission and planned the navigation that made it possible, rarely spoke about it publicly. He understood that leadership meant enabling others to succeed, not claiming their glory. Most of the pilots simply went back to war. There were more missions to fly, more Japanese aircraft to engage, more targets to strike. Yamamoto's death was significant, but it didn't end the war. It didn't even visibly change the war's trajectory. Japan continued fighting with the same determination, the same tactics, the same refusal to accept reality. What changed was invisible. Japanese morale took a blow that never healed. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already cracking after Midway, shattered completely. If Yamamoto could be hunted down and killed, if the architect of Pearl Harbor could die in an American ambush, then everything was vulnerable. Every plan, every operation, every assumption about Japanese superiority was called into question. For the Americans, Yamamoto's death validated the strategic approach they had adopted after Pearl Harbor. Japanese military culture valued individual warrior spirit, tactical brilliance, willingness to sacrifice. American military culture, at least in 1943, was learning to value intelligence, planning, industrial capacity, systematic analysis. The mission that killed Yamamoto demonstrated American strengths. Signals intelligence found the target. Careful planning made interception possible. Engineering provided aircraft with sufficient range. Training and discipline enabled pilots to execute a complex plan under stress. These weren't romantic virtues. Nobody writes poetry about code-breaking or navigation planning. But they won wars in ways that individual heroism couldn't. Yamamoto understood this. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He knew America's industrial power dwarfed Japan's. He knew a prolonged war would end in Japanese defeat. That's why he opposed the war. That's why he told his government they had no chance of long-term success. The tragedy is that Yamamoto, knowing the war was unwinnable, prosecuted it with deadly efficiency anyway. He planned Pearl Harbor. He shaped the operational strategy for Japan's southward expansion. He commanded the combined fleet through its greatest victories and its crucial defeats. He did this not because he believed in victory, but because his duty required it, his honor demanded it, his culture expected it. This same sense of duty, honor, and cultural expectation sent him flying to Bougainville on April 18, 1943, despite warnings, despite obvious risk, despite clear indications that the Americans were more capable and better informed than Japanese intelligence believed. The institutional culture that valued appearance over security, morale over survival, killed him as surely as Rex Barber's .50 caliber bullets. After the war, when the full story of Operation Vengeance finally became public, it stood as a case study in multiple disciplines. For intelligence officers, it demonstrated the value of signals intelligence and the difficulty of protecting sources and methods. For aviation historians, it showcased the P-38's capabilities and the skill of the pilots who flew it. For students of strategy, it raised questions about targeted killing of enemy commanders, about weighing tactical advantage against strategic cost. For military historians studying Japanese decision-making, Operation Vengeance revealed something more troubling. It showed how an organization could receive accurate warnings, understand the threat, acknowledge the risk, and proceed anyway because institutional culture didn't permit any other choice. It showed how loyalty to command authority, commitment to announced plans, and concern for morale could override basic operational security. This wasn't unique to Japan. Every military organization struggles with the tension between flexibility and discipline, between adapting to new information and maintaining the chain of command, between acknowledging hard truths and preserving morale. But Japan's military culture in the 1940s took these tensions to an extreme that proved catastrophic. Yamamoto's death didn't teach the lesson it should have taught. Japanese forces continued operating with compromised communication security for 2 more years. They continued launching operations that American intelligence predicted and countered. They continued fighting with magnificent courage and inadequate resources until American forces were dropping atomic bombs on Japanese cities. The 16 P-38 pilots who flew Operation Vengeance on April 18, 1943, couldn't know all this. They knew they had a mission to kill a high-value target. They knew it was dangerous. They knew the odds were terrible. They flew it anyway because that was their duty, their mission, their contribution to winning a war that had started with a surprise attack and would end with total victory. Raymond Hine died making that contribution. The others survived to tell the story, though they argued for decades about who deserved credit for the killing shot. The argument missed the point. Operation Vengeance succeeded because 16 pilots worked together, because navigation was perfect, because intelligence was accurate, because timing was precise, because coordination was flawless. Individual heroism mattered. Collective competence mattered more. Yamamoto understood this better than most Japanese officers. He had championed naval aviation when battleship admirals dominated Japanese naval thinking. He had recognized that carrier-based aircraft would dominate the Pacific War. He had built the combined fleet into an instrument capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of ocean. But he also understood Japan's fundamental disadvantage. In a letter he wrote before the war, Yamamoto warned that America's industrial capacity was so superior that prolonged conflict would inevitably favor the United States. He wrote, "In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." This prediction was almost perfectly accurate. Pearl Harbor came December 7th, 1941. Midway came June 4th through 6th, 1942. 6 months, almost to the day. After Midway, Japan never won another major naval engagement. Yamamoto had told them exactly what would happen, and they went to war anyway. His death 11 months after Midway was the consequence of decisions made long before that final flight to Bougainville. The decision to go to war against an enemy with overwhelming industrial advantage. The decision to value morale and appearance over operational security. The decision to ignore warnings about American capabilities. The decision to continue using communication systems that were compromised. 14 minutes. That's how long Yamamoto had between when American P-38s appeared in the sky and when his bomber crashed into the jungle. 14 minutes from interception to death. But the chain of decisions that led to those 14 minutes stretched back years. The staff officer who insisted on radioing Yamamoto's detailed itinerary instead of hand-carrying it to Bougainville. The intelligence officers who dismissed evidence of American code-breaking capabilities. The planners who approved a flight route that took Japan's most important naval commander within range of American fighters. The cultural assumptions that made canceling the flight impossible once it was announced. Every link in that chain was a choice. Every choice reflected priorities, assumptions, institutional culture. Together they put Yamamoto in the sky over Bougainville at precisely the moment American fighters arrived to kill him. The Americans made choices too. The cryptographers who broke JN-25 and continued breaking it every time the Japanese made modifications. The intelligence analysts who recognized Yamamoto's itinerary for what it was. The commanders who decided killing him was worth risking the code-breaking secret. The pilots who volunteered for a mission with 1,000-to-1 odds. The mechanics who installed extra fuel tanks and ship compasses. The planners who calculated navigation to the minute. Both sides made choices. Both sides acted according to their training, their culture, their understanding of the war. But American choices reflected adaptability, willingness to take calculated risks, confidence in technical solutions to military problems. Japanese choices reflected rigidity, concern for appearances, reluctance to question established assumptions. The result was 14 minutes of combat that killed one of the war's most important commanders and demonstrated which approach would prevail in the Pacific War. Yamamoto's body, recovered from the jungle, showed 2 bullet wounds. The head wound killed him probably instantly. He died still gripping his sword, the blade he had carried since he was young, the symbol of samurai heritage that he and his nation valued so deeply. That image, the admiral dead in the jungle clutching his sword, captured something essential about Japan's approach to the war. Honor, tradition, warrior spirit. Noble qualities, insufficient to overcome industrial power, intelligence superiority, and willingness to adapt. The P-38 that shot him down represented the opposite approach. It was designed by engineers to solve specific problems. Range, speed, firepower, all optimized through systematic analysis. The pilots who flew it were trained extensively, supported by logistics networks that stretched across the Pacific, guided by intelligence that came from breaking enemy codes through patient mathematical work. No poetry in that, no romance, just effectiveness. And in total war, effectiveness matters more than nobility. Thank you for watching. Most of them received no medals, no monuments, only stories left behind. If this touched your heart, please subscribe so they will not be forgotten.